options. A disclaimer: we're not Microsoft. It's a long text. I'll put it on screen. You can read it at your own time. Put it on pause. But the main thing is we're not Microsoft. Whatever we say here is us. It's all us. It's all about our, practical implementation. Things. If we emphasize certain things, there's a reason why we emphasize them. If we skip certain things, there's a reason why we skip them. They're not probably that important in the majority of situations. So always check Microsoft product terms. And now it includes online service terms. So all the Azure terms are there on the Microsoft product terms website. So whatever you hear today, here's the disclaimer: we may be wrong. If you want the right answer, it's on the product terms website. We just explain it to you, but for the actual authoritative information, you should know that. So an intro to Microsoft Azure. So Azure by design is a service platform. So its native licensing is you pay for an online service, you pay for what you consume, and sometimes licenses are included. And the license cost is included in this service. That's the default approach. If you don't have licenses, you can already go and procure the majority of what you will want in the Microsoft world from Azure, with exceptions. And we'll mention them in the last part of the video, so make sure you survive until the end. There's also a concept of bring your own license, because if you need to bring your own license, or if you want to bring your own license, Microsoft provides various options depending on the platform. So some platforms give you more, some platforms give you less. I mean, Microsoft allows you to do less. Azure, being Microsoft's native platform, has benefits compared to all the other providers and cloud platforms. And the first benefit here is Azure hybrid or Azure hybrid use benefit, AHub or AHB AHub most frequently, which is available for two products, Windows Server and SQL Server. And that is one of the reasons why we added specific sections to this training about these two products today. License mobility. License mobility through software assurance allows you to take eligible licenses to various providers, including Azure. So Azure is not an exception. Azure is license mobility plus Azure Hybrid benefit. That's what I wanted to say. And also, if you buy IT services from an outsourcer or a service provider, and they have a so-called SPLA, service provider licensing agreement, they have to manage those instances, but they may deploy or manage instances for you in Azure and provide licenses for those instances through their SPLA, which is essentially a subscription agreement. So as you can see, various options. What's not available? You may have heard, and you can read about it on our website on SAMexpert.com, that Microsoft in October 2022 introduced a new licensing perk, which is called Flexible Virtualization Benefit. Flexible Virtualization Benefit is not available on so-called listed providers, which are Amazon, Google, Alibaba, and Microsoft. So flexible virtualization benefit does not work with Azure at all. And as I said, and I will say again, some solutions require bring your own license. So there are scenarios of usage of Microsoft software where you cannot just get away without using Microsoft's software. If you allow me a few seconds, I need to check something, whether that's it's actually being streamed to YouTube. I don't know, just a few seconds really. And whilst I'm at that, if you have any more questions or if you want to say hello, please do that in the chat. What I'm doing right now is I'm on my phone. I'm opening our channel, and just to see whether the session is streaming. Being streamed to YouTube. Yes, it is streaming. So good. We're good. Just in case. We had some connection issues before, but fortunately we've sorted them. So here are the licensing metrics. So how you are billed, or how the licenses that you bring, in this case, we're talking about billing, measured. So how is that price calculated? How's the cost calculated? The majority of computer-related metrics are consumption-based. It's virtual machines, database service. I have another slide, next slide, where I'll give you a few examples. Storage, artificial intelligence, it's all based on the consumptionals, how much and for how long you consume. There are also per-user services, like Active Directory, information protection, Microsoft Defender, that if you know how Microsoft 365 is licensed, it's exactly the same model. Almost everybody now has Microsoft 365. It's licensed through pay-user subscriptions. So Azure has a whole list, I think over 100 services that are licensed in the same manner per user. You subscribe per user. So you consume user subscriptions, not consumption metrics. And there are also products on the marketplace, which are, third-party products, and they may have various metrics. So it depends. So if you're buying something that is not Microsoft from the marketplace, check the metrics there in these particular products and those particular products. And here are a few examples of service consumption metrics. So virtual machines are charged per hour, or actually, if I'm absolutely correct, it's per minute. Database services are licensed per gigabyte normally. When I'm talking about services, not virtual machines with SQL. Virtual machines with SQL are virtual machines. Point number one on this slide. Storage is per gigabyte, and artificial intelligence can be per transaction. Obviously, there may be bundles, discounts, reservations, all the other stuff. So, but this is just to give you an idea of how Azure is effectively licensed with the included licenses or included services. They don't require licenses. For example, storage does not require licenses. It's just a storage. You just pay for hard drives in the cloud. There are various ways to pay for Azure, and we're going to go into much more details in the Azure cost management training. You can see them on this slide. I'm not going to waste a lot of your time. We'd rather talk about licensing details in this training than about this. But you can put this slide on pause. You can look at it, and you just can see that some things, for example, could be paid monthly in arrears. Some things must be paid monthly or annually upfront. It depends. There's no one size fits all. There's no one single model. It is a bit complicated. It is a bit complicated, and you need to understand this. Again, take a screenshot, look at this slide. I don't really need to explain it to you. How do you buy Azure? Most of the of those who begin Azure journey, if they are not enterprises, so if you're below, let's say 500 seats, even 500 to 2,400 seats, these days you'll probably start your journey with buying those services from a Microsoft partner, a so-called CSP partner. The traditional way hasn't gone anywhere. So large corporations buy Azure through EA or through an Azure Mac, somehow attached to EA enterprise agreements. So it's all pretty standard. Again, large corporations are now directly approached by Microsoft. And Microsoft is even trying to squeeze out licensing resellers from some strategic accounts. And that includes direct deals with Microsoft on procuring large volumes of Azure from Microsoft themselves without a middleman. And in small quantities, I don't think enterprises would do this, but small businesses would probably not even go to a CSP partner, but they may start with just going to Azure.com and buying services directly there using a credit card. Simple as that, credit card payment. So a little bit on channels and how they're called. If you are from procurement and you're watching this video, so you need to learn a few bits of Microsoft lingo. So the CSP partners in the Microsoft world, in the commercial world, are called breadth motion, which is from from 1 to 2,400 seats. Enterprise agreements, etc. They're in the enterprise motion, so 2,400 seats and higher. And enterprise agreement overlap with the breadth sector as well. And self-service motion is what it is. It's what it says on the tin. It's when you self-service yourselves, you go to the website and you procure those services using credit cards. Another introductory slide, and this is the last introductory slide in this presentation, is here is the structure of how Azure is structured high level. Why do you need to know this? Because in the following slides, I may refer to resource groups or subscriptions or tenants. So Azure is organized. This is a very simplified diagram in the following manner. You will have an organization's tenant. In addition to that, there may be additional subscriptions for developers and some enthusiastic employees. They create their own subscriptions, which are not under your tenant. What we advise is keep an eye on that and try to centralize everything so that all your subscriptions are under one tenant. Developers could have their own sandboxes, that's fine. But other employees and departments should really stick to the main subscription, because that's where you probably will manage costs. That's why you probably reserved instances, and you probably don't even have visibility of additional subscriptions. So subscriptions, I've just mentioned them. Subscriptions are sitting under the tenant. And each subscription may have various resource groups, and under those resource groups, you get resources. So, your VMs, your storage, and stuff like that. So here's the kind of here is the high-level overview of how Azure is organized and grouped. So coming up next is, we only have 3 sections. It's not a long training. We're going to talk about Windows Server in Azure and how Azure virtual machine costs are built and what cost-saving options you have. So this is not a cost management training, but we must mention cost-saving options. And the same about SQL Server, and then other software in Azure, whether the software that you may bring or the software that you must bring if you want to use specific services or specific software on hosting in the Microsoft's Azure Cloud Platform. I'll take that question. I promised you to take this question. I'll try and answer it. Sometimes it's difficult to answer questions like this. We have Microsoft Office project, etc., perpetual licenses in a large number, and then we want to migrate to Office 365. Then how can we utilize those perpetual licenses, which will be waste after migration to cloud? Good question. Firstly, you'll probably let me say it this way. Many of our clients will still have, especially large companies, some sort of configurations where they still require perpetual license. For example, you may migrate to Office 365 and still have legacy instances of Office in servers to which your home workers still connect, maybe directly, maybe indirectly through another piece of software, and it's still there. How do you license that? Office 365 licenses do not cover legacy Office installations and access to legacy Office installations in RDP, so you probably find a way. I'm not sure, Nishant, where you're from, so it really depends. If you work with a European company, if you're in Europe, for example, so European Union, companies in European Union and the UK still, unless our crazy government, I'm in the UK, I'm British myself, unless our crazy government decides to completely abolish all the EU rules and regulations and whatnot, we are also still allowed to resell second-hand licenses. It's possible. It is legal, but only in Europe and the UK. Otherwise, yes, it is. Well, it's not necessarily waste, but you've paid for it. You've used it. Now it's just there. Pretty legitimate licenses. You probably won't have that much use for them otherwise. So it was a simple question. And we are moving on to Windows Server in Azure, which is an exciting subject. So for those of you who want to learn more about SQL Server, by the way, Please watch the previous part 3 because that was dedicated to SQL on-premises in Azure, but by all means, we're going to cover it today as well. So Windows 7 Azure, without further ado, let me jump straight into it. So Azure, whatever it's called in various parts of the world, Azure, the cost consists of various parts. Part number 1, for simplicity, I called it compute, but it also includes storage, networking, and whatnot. But virtual machines are basically compute and the cost of the Windows Server license. And normally from Azure, when you buy it without any additional changes and tweaks, you'll pay per minute for both, for compute and for a license. And that is a license included option. Such machines are, from the cost perspective, best for temporary workloads. If you need something more advanced, then and you want long-term workloads, you have ways to reduce the kind of off-the-shelf costs of Azure VMs. And for the compute, there are reserved instances. Nowadays, there's also an Azure savings plan, which we'll cover in the next training that will be dedicated to Azure cost management. For Windows Server licenses, in Azure, not on any other provider or cloud platform, you have Azure Hybrid Benefits. And they save a lot. On Windows Server, the savings are quite substantial. So let's talk about Azure Hybrid Benefit. There are differences in what you're allowed to do with Windows Server licenses depending on their edition. Right now, you may bring 2 editions to Azure, only 2 editions. One is Windows Server Standard. The other one is Windows Server Data Center, which is a bigger edition, more expensive. It's about 5 times more expensive, 5 times, almost 6 point something times more expensive than Standard. But it has its own licensing perks, which we will also cover. And we already have previous years Windows Server dedicated training, but it's one of the next sessions. By the way, I need to plug this in. On our channel here on YouTube, on the community tab, and on our LinkedIn page, today we published polls for you to vote and choose the topic for the March training. So last time I checked, there was a competition between Azure Cost Management and Windows Server licensing. Please choose what you want. The more votes we get, the more representative that poll is. So yeah, the choice is up to you. Windows Server Standard licenses may not be simultaneously used in Azure and on-premises. Windows Server Data Center licenses may be used simultaneously on-premises and in Azure. Licensing rules are different, so obviously on-premises, they must follow the on-premises rules. In Azure, through Hybrid Benefit, you assign them to virtual machines. How? Just wait a couple of slides, I'll explain it to you. Subscription licenses through CSP, and I need to update this slide. So there's a mistake on this slide. Now we have subscription licenses for Windows Server Data Center. And actually, if you bear with me, I will update it now. So from basically a few months ago, Microsoft changed it, and now we have an updated slide. Simple as that. So subscription CSP licenses also work exactly the same way as licenses with software assurance, active software assurance, through volume licensing. And what you may notice here is that perpetual licenses without software assurance, without you paying some sort of subscription fee to Microsoft, you may not use Azure Hybrid Benefit. It requires a subscription. As I said already, Windows Server Standard allows you dual use only for 100, I didn't say this. I said you can't use it simultaneously. Yes, you can, but only once when you just started migrating to Azure for 180 days. After that, you must decide whether you want to keep them on premise because you still have servers there to license, or you want to move them to Azure because you decommissioned on premises service. You've had enough time. You've had almost 6 months to do the migration. You've decommissioned them on premise. You don't need the license anymore. Move them to Azure. You still need to maintain software assurance and or subscription on those licenses, though. You may, at some point, decide, you know what, I want to switch to pay-as-you-go on Azure for whatever reason, and I just need those licenses back on premise. You must wait for 90 days. You can't just simply reassign them back. And Microsoft will know. If they audit you, they will know. Windows Server Data Center allows you dual use. You may use those licenses on premise and in Azure at the same time, unless it's on dedicated hosts. So simultaneous use is allowed when you use them on premises as usual, as whatever, however you want. But in that case, for simultaneous use, for dual use, you may only assign them to virtual machines. If you want to assign them to dedicated hosts, you may, but in that case, there's no dual use. You just basically move them. Same 180 days rule applies for Windows Server Standard. All right, moving on. How do we calculate Windows Server licenses for Azure High Benefits? So rule number one, minimum of 16 cores must be assigned to Azure. So you may not move only 8 cores to Azure. And there's a very funny rule around that, which I'm still not convinced entirely about. What it says is the first 16 cores may be assigned to 2 virtual machines. And there's a theory that you may have a 4-core virtual machine and a 12-core virtual machine and assign them in that manner. To be honest, I wouldn't risk with it. I wouldn't risk it because normally the normal logic is a machine must consume at least 8 cores. It's just the way it's worded. But normally, you know what? A friend of mine once said, if you found a loophole, you think you found a loophole in the Microsoft licensing, you haven't. It's their licenses. I wouldn't risk it. But then again, the minimum for a single virtual machine is 8 cores. You may not assign less than that. If you have a 2-core virtual machine, you still must assign 8 cores. And on small virtual machines, Azure Hybrid Benefit may not be that beneficial cost-wise. And I would encourage you to go to the Azure pricing calculator, just Google it or Bing it, type Azure pricing calculator and play with the numbers. You can see the price difference between license included and Azure Hybrid Benefit there. And you will notice that on small virtual machines, the benefits are tiny, if they even exist. Anything above 8 cores, you'll see very substantial savings. Especially that there is no stipulation around what edition you must bring. And here's the catch. When you, which is a good one, it's a perk, it's not a catch. When you procure licenses included from Azure, you get Windows Server Data Center license. Because the machines in Azure, all the machines in Azure that you deploy from, at least from their images, are Windows Server Data Center machines. So therefore, the license that's included is Windows Server Data Center. You may assign Windows Server standard licenses using the same calculation. There are no multipliers. It's all the same. It is completely edition agnostic for Windows Server. With SQL Server, you must pay attention to what edition of the license you assign. With Windows Server, the cheapest way is to assign Windows Server standard licenses on a subscription. Obviously, you may not use them simultaneously on premises and in the cloud. But what we see is that the economic effect is much better using Windows Server standard licenses. One note here about the 16-core pack, because I'm really tired of it. It's people who continue saying that rubbish. They say that a 16-core pack is a single license, therefore it may only be assigned to a single VM. Microsoft even has guides that confirm that a 16-core pack could be split between two virtual machines. They even explain to you in the recent Windows Server licensing guide, in the frequently asked questions, there's a question: may I split 16-core packs across multiple servers? And the answer from Microsoft is yes. So if somebody tells you can't do that, just ignore them. Don't even, I will ignore it from now on, because Microsoft came back and said, yes, you can do that. You can split the packs between machines. A bit of, I don't know why I left this slide, but it's here, so let's talk about it. So, I remember now. With Azure Hybrid Benefit, so we'll talk about reserved instances in another training, and about also, so Carl just said in our comments that there are also spot instances. We'll mention them in the course management training. So there are spot instances, and you can use them, but I won't use Azure Hybrid Benefits with them because what this slide says is that you must explicitly tell Azure that I want to use my own license with this virtual machine. It's not like reserved instance where you may assign it to a subscription or to a resource group or to you have to actually assign licenses that you bring to specific virtual machines. It's either manually or with a script. Most people actually do it manually. So therefore, spot instances don't work with Azure Hybrid Benefits at all. I have a question for you. If you want to have a bit of interactive fun, and thank you everybody who's joining us right now. Appreciating that we're already 40 minutes into training. If you say hello, I'd really appreciate it. If you push the like button, smash, boop, whatever the word is, I would appreciate it too. Because when you press like, if you genuinely like it, if you don't like it, don't press like. If you genuinely like it, you press like. YouTube then sees that, thinks it's a good video, and it shows this video to more people, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're actually spreading knowledge here. It's not an advertisement. It's a bit, but it's not. So here's a question for you. It's a kind of like, almost like a test. So you procure the reserved instance, then you deleted the virtual machine. What happens next? The answer is you must reassign the reserved instance. You lose your reserved instance entirely, or it's reassigned automatically. It was on the previous slide, if you paid attention. I won't stay on this slide. Please give your answers in the chat. And we'll move on to the SQL Server, because the next section is SQL Server. And after that, we'll talk about other software in Azure, software that you may bring, and software that you sometimes must bring to Azure using your own licenses. Right. Let me remember the questions so I can then give you the right answer. I'm talking about reserved instances here, not licenses. Please pay attention. SQL Server in Azure. Let me go to the title slide because I need it for the video. There are two types of SQL servers you can procure from Azure. Infrastructure as a service, which are just normal virtual machines that run on Windows Server, and they have SQL Server installed inside the virtual machine, and you manage the virtual machine. It's you buy infrastructure. SQL runs on top of that infrastructure. But you may also decide, you know what, I don't want to manage Windows. I want to buy platform as a service. I want to buy SQL Server, and you even have two options for platform as a service. One of these options is manage SQL Server instances, so you get the entire server. And then you can create databases, drop databases, do whatever you want with those databases. You can change the schemas, master and whatever the other database is. I haven't touched SQL for a few years. You can do that. It's your entire SQL server, but you do not manage the operating system that runs it. How good is that? And then you have SQL Server databases. It is exactly what it says on the tin. You get a database. And you manage the database. You play with the database, but you can't change any parameters of the server, because the server is managed by Microsoft. So see, you have basically 3 levels of outsourcing responsibilities for certain things to Microsoft, and you choose what you want to do yourselves and whether you want to pay for it. Cost reduction for SQL Server, which again we'll cover in much more detail in a specialized training later. For compute, it's reserved instances or Azure savings plans. For Windows Server licenses, what I just said, Azure Hybrid Benefit, and also you have the same option of Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server, but it works differently to Windows Server. Please do not confuse them. Windows Server and SQL Server, Azure Hybrid Benefits, although it has exactly the same name, works in different ways. They work in different ways. So infrastructure as a service. When you procure virtual machines, here is how it works. There's no simultaneous use, regardless of the edition. So after 180 days, after migrating one way to Azure, not backwards, you have to decide where you want to keep your license, there or there. That is your only dual running, dual use period, 180 days since you started migrating. That is effectively per virtual machine. So it could be staggered migration. So you migrate one license, you migrate the next license, you can have a whole project plan of how you migrate licenses. But you must remember the 180 days rule, because, well, auditors are going to see this if you get an audit. How do you calculate infrastructure as a service licenses for SQL Server? And we also covered it in much more detail in the previous training that was dedicated to SQL Server, but today we're talking about Azure, so we must mention it anyway. There's a minimum of 4 cores. Remember, Windows Server, what was the minimum? It was 8 cores. SQL Server, 4 cores to a virtual machine. If there's a bigger virtual machine, you may assign more cores to match it. And because machines are never, so there are no odd numbers in the core count in Azure. So it's going to be 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 if they exist, 16. Anyway, you may assign SQL Server in the increments of 2 licenses. When your VM grows, or you just procure a larger VM from the start. But the minimum is 4. For a 2-core virtual machine, you still need 4 cores. And by the way, that's another difference when you procure machines with license included from Azure, is that Windows Server, if you buy a 2-core virtual machine, Microsoft is going to only charge you for 2 cores Windows Server license. But SQL Server always starts from 4, even with the license included options. Why? I don't think anybody has any idea why. It's just a fact. You just need to know it. Carl has a good question about migration, and let me pick it up. I like interaction, so ask your questions in the chat. This is an interactive session. We have not that many people today, unfortunately, but well, there's a whole crowd watching, so you probably have questions. Do ask. So Carl is asking, what if during the migration you have to abort the migration, e.g. some services are degraded? May a customer revert the migration and try again later? Strictly speaking, if we just follow the rule, these exceptional circumstances are not, they don't have any provisions related to them. So I don't think so. Whether in practice Microsoft will listen to you, probably. If you have a good technical account manager and licensing account manager, if you explain it to them, even during an audit, it might work. But don't try and make it up. If it's an actual event and you have a story behind it, build a case. Otherwise, just what's written in the Microsoft Online Services terms and product terms, there are no such exceptions. Let's carry on. So, cross-edition assignment is possible for SQL Server, which means you may license a SQL Server Enterprise virtual machine with standard licenses, and vice versa. Standard license, SQL Server edition with enterprise licenses. And if you remember, on-premises licensing, so licensing standard instances with enterprise licenses is nothing unusual. It's normal. It's called down editioning. Licensing enterprise instances with standard licenses is unusual. It only exists through Azure Hybrid Benefit, but there's a big but. Again, another massive difference between Windows Server and SQL in Azure. If for Windows Server, you may take Windows Server standard licenses and assign without any multiplications to a Windows Server data center virtual machine in Azure. On SQL, you must apply multipliers. And let me show you what I mean on a couple of slides. Slide number 1, we have a SQL Server 8-core machine. And the first licensing option is straightforward. There are 8 cores of SQL Server Enterprise. Therefore, we assign 8 cores of, SQL Server. There are 8 cores of SQL Server Enterprise. Therefore, we assign 8 cores of SQL Server Enterprise licenses. 8 single core licenses, or a single 8-core pack. It's not a license, it's an 8-core pack, a pack of 8 licenses. Option number 2, I don't have SQL Server Enterprise licenses, but it so happened that during various migrations and virtualizations, because I didn't pay attention to my licenses on premise, I realized I've got almost 1,000 SQL Server standard licenses. That's, by the way, it's not such a rare event. 1,000 SQL Server standard licenses on premises, which I have nowhere to use. I continue paying software assurance for them. May I use them in Azure to license my SQL Server Enterprise instances? You guessed it. Yes, you may, but you have to multiply the requirements by 4. So in this case, it requires 32 SQL Server standard single core licenses to license this SQL Server virtual machine for SQL Server. Multiply by 4. Works exactly the same way backwards. And here's an interesting thing. So please bear with me until I finish this story about this slide. You deploy a SQL Server standard machine which has 8 cores, and obviously, because I said SQL Server standard machine, it has SQL Server standard installed in it, in that virtual machine. And then you think, what licenses may I assign to it? And then again, the first option that you have is option number 2, actually, in this slide, is you may just one-to-one assign 8 single core SQL Server standard licenses to this virtual machine with SQL Server. But what we find is that it's cheaper to assign only 2 SQL Server Enterprise licenses. And the question I had during the last training, so how does it work? Because the minimum was 4 cores. Can I assign 2? So here's the deal. The minimums apply to the actual edition of the machine or of the instance or of the managed database or of the managed instance. And then when you recalculate that into the enterprise edition, you basically divide it by 4. Therefore, in this case, assigning 2 enterprise licenses is completely legitimate. It's entirely okay. Moving on. Unlimited virtualization for SQL Server Enterprise does work as on-premise on Azure dedicated hosts, exactly as on-premise. So if you want to know how that works, watch the previous training, part number 3 in the 2022-2023 series, just the previous session. And there we explain how to use unlimited virtualization for SQL Server Enterprise. Essentially, dedicated hosts are almost like your on-premises hosts. Most of the rules apply, with a couple of exceptions, which we'll mention. So in the platform as a service, which is a different way, so let me remind you, you do not procure virtual machines in this case. You procure managed service. Please. You procure managed service or instances, or you procure managed databases, so you do not have visibility and access to the operating system. In this case, there are no reserved instances. There's reserved capacity. And on the licensing side, and today we're talking about licensing, is the same Azure Hybrid Benefit. Exactly the same. The same rules apply for simultaneous use. And the same rules apply for calculating the licenses. You still have this either multiplier or divider of 4 that you must assign. So it must apply to the licenses if you use a different edition to the one that you procured. However, here you need to remember the following thing. General purpose or hyperscale equals SQL Server Enterprise. Business critical equals, let me go back. I need to rephrase this. General purpose or hyperscale equals SQL Server Standard. Business critical equals SQL Server Enterprise. All the rest is basically the same as long as you remember that. So SQL failover rules. Azure allows you with SQL Server 2022, and as far as I remember, it started with SQL Server 2019, to deploy one instance for disaster recovery in Azure. You must tell Azure that you're using a disaster recovery instance, but you can do that without paying Azure, either paying license included or bringing your own license if that instance is used for disaster recovery. It may not be a high availability instance. It has to be turned on manually. And if you want to learn more about SQL Server failover in general, watch the previous part of the training, which was dedicated to SQL Server. But good news, and it really doesn't matter now whatever happened before. Microsoft flipped the switch in December, and now everything works the same way in Azure. So previously, you had to license, if you bought license included SQL Server from Azure, you had to pay even for disaster recovery and failover and high availability instances. Now, they're discounted. That's big, massive good news for cost reduction and cost management. And I encourage you, if you are an Azure user, reread the rules yourselves, find licensing guides, study them, make sure you understand it. If you don't understand, if you have questions, reach out to us and we'll try and help you. And then check your existing instances in Azure for which you pay license for license included, and see whether you can tell Azure that, by the way, this is a failover instance. You told me it's free, just the licensing portion. You still have to pay for the virtual machine. So I have a question for you. And by the way, the previous question, let me scroll back to that. So let's have fun with this question. So I told you, please pay attention. This was not an easy question. I was talking about reserved instances. Reserved instances are reassigned automatically between virtual machines in the same family of the same type of virtual machine. They are. You delete it. Reserved instances get reassigned by Azure. Licenses never get reassigned by Azure. You have to do it manually. However, by the way, if anyone here is cheekily listening to me, but they know more than I about SQL Server in Azure, I may be wrong, but I think that Microsoft promised that SQL Server Azure Hybrid Benefit will be also automatically reassigned between the instances in Azure. I don't understand how this is going to work because cost benefits are different. But it's maybe the case. I need to check it. I need to check it myself. I need to check whether that's true because I remember the promise. I don't remember the execution on that promise. And here's the question for you to play with. Can you assign SQL Server standard licenses to a SQL Enterprise virtual machine? And you know what's funny is we've just talked about it, and half of the answers we get to this question during live trainings is wrong. So yes, you may use SQL Server standard licenses to, and this is in Azure, assigned to SQL Server Enterprise virtual machine in Azure. And no, you may not. You have to always use SQL Server Enterprise licenses. And moving on, beyond Windows Server and SQL Server, and we've got about 10 minutes more. So I promised you to do this in 1 hour. It's getting a bit longer, but it's not going to be much longer. So we are approaching the first hour already in 2 minutes. Remote desktop access. That is the scenario. Remember, I told you multiple times that in certain cases, you must bring your licenses to Azure. You can't procure them from Azure. There's no way. They just don't sell it. And other service providers, listed providers like Amazon and Google, there are certain cases when you already can buy those licenses from AWS. I think, as far as I remember, now it's only with Visual Studio. There's no such provision in Azure. You always have to bring your RDS licenses. So if you only access to Windows Server virtual machine as an administrator, and you use the built-in remote desktop administration, 2 connections, not actually 3, but okay, 2 connections, then you don't need RDS cows. But if you allow your users, that's a very important caveat, your users to access remote desktop on Windows Server in Azure, then you must license RDS as you would license it on premises. And as I said, there's no way you can buy those licenses from Azure. So you have to go to a licensing reseller, or you may bring your existing licenses with software assurance. You may use your existing licenses with software assurance in Azure. Or if you have a service provider you work with, you may rent RDS SaaS from them, but I would be careful about it because, strictly speaking, the rules of SPLA dictate that before they give you the license, they must manage the service. Not every provider follows this, and then they suffer during audits. But the rule of the law, I mean, obviously, Microsoft product terms is not a law, but what it dictates is you must bring those licenses somehow. Bring your own license on dedicated hosts is complicated, and it works almost exactly the same as in any other listed provider. Licenses that you bought before 1st of October 2019. Plus, there's a very good comment that I should have put on this slide. It comes from Amazon, and I agree with them. Is if you if you bought the initial license before 1st of October 2019, and then you continue to pay for software assurance on the same license, and you do not upgrade the instance to anything about Windows Server 2019, then you may bring those licenses to even see it even says software assurance is not required. You may bring them to the dedicated host. Otherwise, dedicated hosts, if licenses are more fresh, if you bought them after 1st of October 2019, which was 3.5 years ago. Otherwise, whether that's dedicated or shared, you probably won't do this for Windows, but say Exchange or anything like that. First, the products have to have license mobility. If a product doesn't have license mobility through software assurance, you may not bring it. So you need to check whether the product has license mobility through software assurance. Where do you do that? You do this in product terms. And here's an example here that shows you that Windows Server, for example, only has license mobility for external connectors. So you need to check if, say, for example, if you want to bring Office to Azure, Office Professional Plus, not Office 365, go to product terms, find Office Professional Plus, and check whether it has license mobility. If it doesn't, well, no luck. But if the product has license mobility, then you may deploy it in Azure virtual machines, but you have to go through the so-called license verification process, and you must fill in a license verification form and send it to Microsoft, and Microsoft will check whether they agree that you have enough licenses. Then they sign it off, send it back to you, and then you may use the licenses. So as Microsoft is a provider for themselves, you don't need to resend that form to them again. So just one step. You just ask them for permission in writing. They reply to you in writing. You get your permission. You may deploy your licenses. I wouldn't do that for SQL Server, because for SQL Server, there's much better Azure Hybrid benefits. But any other software, for example, I think it's a good example, Beanstalk, you may use a license mobility through software assurance to deploy Beanstalk using your licenses in Azure. There you go. Plus, subscriber access license may also be brought to Azure, but I think it's a bit of a complicated topic for such a long training. I mean, we've been through almost 1 hour. And by the way, start asking your questions because I'm wrapping up. The next training, so as you can see on this slide, the destiny of this training session was chosen by you. You voted. You told us you want to talk about licensing in Azure. As you can see, that there were fewer votes, 1/10 of the LinkedIn votes on YouTube. There were still votes on YouTube, so we combined them all together. Still, licensing in Azure. Today's session, it won. If you want to vote for the next topic, you can even suggest yours in the comments. If you want to vote for the next topic in February, I think it's going to be the 21st of February. I may be wrong. I think it's 21st. 22nd, because it starts with the first. Then vote. Tell us, I want this, and we'll deliver. We always do. And on that note, I invite you to, firstly, please come to the SAMexpert Academy. By the way, let me show you this website. I mean, right now, there's not much, but it's very, very rapidly growing. So here's my browser. Let me put it on screen with lots of various stuff. You can see lots of links to licensing partner announcements and stuff like that. So, SAMexpert.academy. It's our secondary website. It's not the main website. So here we only publish training materials, and there's our podcast, which you can also find on Spotify, Google, and Apple, and other platforms that actually just grab podcasts on those 3 platforms. But what's important is our courses. So this free course that you also can watch on YouTube, but you can also register on the Academy website. Subscribe to our mailing list if you want to. You don't have to. And go to this Microsoft License Management free. Some people get confused with this page. You need to enter your email address and full name and register on that particular platform. Get access to the same videos. Why would you want to do so? Is in time, we're going to add more material, even probably slides, to that training, which we may not do on YouTube due to YouTube's technical limitations. So that particular training is going to be developed. On the basis of our free training, we're going to develop very focused commercial trainings for some reasonable price. And also, there's already one commercial training. If anyone of you works for a service provider and you can afford, it's not a cheap training. I must admit, but there's a lot of value. There's like 6 hours of purely distilled information for service providers from complete zero. Microsoft licensing explained from the point of view of service providers. OEM licenses explained from the point of service providers. CSP hosting, new modules being added right now to that training. So if you need a discount, if you can't afford that, drop me a line. I'll give you a promotional code. This is my personal promise. So on this note, I'd like to thank you for being with us today, and tell your friends. I must say I'm a little bit upset with the number of people that joined us today. I expected a little bit more, because we had about 900 in the first session. And if you want to certify, if you want to get a certificate from SAMexpert, you must watch all these trainings. So just the basics covers only about 30% of the material in the exam. And we have an exam, and it's very tough. The pass rate is ridiculous, 5%. So 95% of people who attempt our exam fail. But those who pass it, potentially, when our company grows, I'll be looking at who passed the exam to see, whom I will probably review as a potential candidate, because I know that person, even if they cheated, they made an effort. It's very difficult, by the way, to cheat this exam. So, obviously, again, thank you. And thanks for your thanks. I've got a few here. Yeah, Carl, I know, always nice to have feedback from you, Carl. Personal thanks, to the entire, in front of the entire community, to you for all your feedback, all your suggestions, your critique of the exam questions, which is also good and very useful. Please come again. And Yadal, thank you. Thank you too. And on this note, yeah, thanks. And I'll see you next Wednesday with the Microsoft licensing news and analysis of those news. Hopefully, because, sorry, next Wednesday, why did I say Tuesday? Next Wednesday, 3 o'clock, same time each week, 3 p.m. London time. So in America, in the Eastern, it's going to be 10 o'clock, 10 a.m., isn't it? Or is it 9 a.m.? Obviously, California is more earlier, but then Californians wake up early. I mean, we work with Californians and they're early risers, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock is fine. And yeah, and 4 o'clock, 4 p.m. on Europe. Australia is a bit out of luck. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a bit inconvenient time for you guys there, but you can watch it recorded. And please come to the next live and please bring your questions. These sections are interactive, as you may see. We take questions. We respond to virtually any question that we get here on the channel, through LinkedIn, through email, unless you ask us to do work for free. In that case, I'll send you a bill. But any advice to a fellow ITAM, SAM, licensing, or procurement person, you know where to find us. Thank you. And on this note, and by the way, I'll put a video here that I suggest you watching. Watch it, please. Cheers.